Hello, my friends. Welcome to me, your host, Christian Watson. So, we are about to do it once again. This video from henceforth is now addressed to the British Broadcasting Corporation and their Chief Diversity Officer, Miranda Wayland. Dear BBC and Co. Now, look, I know it's probably odd having an American guy making a video about this, and especially a guy who doesn't really watch a lot of TV dramas, a guy who really hasn't watched a TV series since Sleepy Hollow went off of the air a few years ago. But I found it incredibly concerning to read the words of one of the top-ranking officials in the British Broadcasting Corporation as it relates to one of their most popular series, Luther. Now, for those of you who are unacquainted, the BBC, their Chief Diversity Officer, Miranda Wayland, Miranda, you made a statement about how Idris Elba's character, John Luter, was not black enough. In fact, I will quote your own statement, Miranda. The UK cop, quote, doesn't have any black friends and doesn't eat any Caribbean food. Now, there was, of course, a stir about this. A lot of black conservatives were incredibly and justifiably angry about stereotypes. A lot of non-conservatives, people who simply want to fight stereotypes and the inclusion of stereotypes in the consciousness, were also quite pissed off about this as well. When I first heard this story, Miranda, in BBC, I didn't know what reaction to have. I didn't know if this was simply a pop culture fluke that I ought to ignore. I didn't know if this was simply a glib statement made by someone who comes from a very particular viewpoint but didn't mean to advance it in a serious and intellectual manner, which evident by how you said what you said. I hope that's the case, because if it's not, then you are committing intellectual fraud. Some of the biggest cases of intellectual fraud, if you genuinely believed what you said in this quote. But that's another point. Or 3, I didn't know if to think this was a statement of principles that was not only being seriously advanced, but is indicative of how the BBC itself runs its operations and emerges from a paradigm which is so nauseous, so acidic towards the idea of individualism and the idea of recognizing black people beyond a particular image. Forget stereotypes, Miranda. This goes a little bit beyond that. Because a stereotype is a general idea of how a particular person, based on an arbitrary characteristic, acts. That's egregious. But what's more egregious, Miranda, is if you take that particular idea and you essentialize it to be their entire being, Miranda. You can have a stereotype and still see that person in many different lights than the light of that stereotype. But you can't have this sort of paradigm that I think you're operating with, that I will explain in a moment, without essentializing, reducing the black individual to their blackness and making everything about them black. So I did some digging. And apparently the BBC, like many corporations, is infected with the rot of diversity and inclusion initiatives. Let's understand why it's a rot. Diversity and inclusion initiatives typically incorporate the ideology of intersectionality into their frameworks to ensure that people are being quote unquote heard from a variety of backgrounds, a variety of sources, predicated upon their identity. Intersectionality, as Kimberly Crenshaw, the progenitor of that caustic framework, said, is nothing more than understanding interactions and understanding individuals as it relates to their identities rather than as it relates to who they are as an individual. So, for example, Kimberly Crenshaw says that the intersectional theorist will look at a black woman in school who's having problems as having both race problems and gender problems on a systemic level, rather than simply viewing that as a problem with that individual black woman. And so the BBC's, their website, has a little statement about diversity. It says, and I quote, "At the BBC, we are committed to creating an inclusive workforce by reflecting and representing the diversity of the UK. The BBC is for everyone and should include everyone, whatever their background. We are a diverse organization and have much to be proud of, but we are also challenging ourselves to ensure that diversity and inclusion is hardwired into everything the BBC does." And if, Miranda, your statement is any indication, the BBC is taking a page out of the playbook of some of the dominant ideologies that manifest the diversity and inclusion mindset. Make no mistake, Miranda, I love inclusion. And make no mistake, Miranda, I love diversity. But also make no mistake, Miranda, I think both those two things should be predicated upon universal qualities, not bound to temporal, subjective qualities. Qualities that were outside of my control, or outside of Idris's control, or outside of anyone else's control. Now, of course, a lot of people have been saying that all the chief diversity officer, you, Miranda, were saying is that you simply want to make the character more representative of a certain kind of culture because of its color. But when you view the character not being representative of a certain kind of culture, the character of John Luter, because of his color, you are again reducing that character. You are eliminating hours upon hours upon hours of brilliant incandescent brain power that went into creating this character in the writer's room, and that goes into creating the character's relationships, the character's quirks, their personality, their motivations. There is so much more to a character in a literary or a fantasy setting than simply how they look like. In fact, if a character was simply skin deep, if they were simply representative of what their skin was, that wouldn't be an interesting character whatsoever. Now, the writer of John Luter, to be fair, did say, and I quote, that he didn't have the ability as a white British man to emulate the experience of a black British man. So he said, and I quote, this is the writer, Neil Cross, he said, "It would have been an act of tremendous arrogance for me to try to write a black character. We would have ended up with a slightly embarrassed, ignorant, middle-class white writer's idea of a black character." Now imagine, Neil, if a black person was writing Luter instead. But this black person that came from, I don't know, South Africa, or had came from, inner city Detroit. Do you think the black person from South Africa and the black person from inner city Detroit would have had the same experiences simply predicated upon their race? Or are there simply a multitude of causes, Neil, that might go into formulating the experience of someone that may not be related to how they look? Miranda, BBC, I just have one thing to say to you guys. This kind of stuff is nothing more than the continuation of a vicious ideology that is born, again, as I mentioned, from intersectional theory, and born from the desire not to see me as who I am. Forget stereotypes, that's just one thing. This is the complete and utter usurpation, the complete and utter coup of who I am at the center of my significance. And I don't take that lightly. I don't take that lightly. And so, my friends, we should make sure that things like this don't go unheard. They don't go unchallenged, and they don't go unquestioned. Because mentalities like this, that you push, Miranda, and the BBC pushes, are the same mentalities that will demean our significance as they have done to this fictional character. Because guess what? If it's a fictional character first, but these ideologies operate in the real world, they will have very real and unfictional impacts. Of that I am certain. Think about it. As always, my friends, I love you, and if you love me, please donate to me on Patreon, patreon.com/officialcwatson. Be sure to join the Discord, which is in the link down below. Be sure to comment, like, subscribe, and share. But most importantly, my friends, I love you, and please stay pensive. Bye-bye.